Everyone thinks Family Guy is just noise. Fart jokes, cutaway gags, a dog that talks, and a baby that plots murder. Nothing underneath any of it. Watch these 10 scenes back to back, and a completely different show starts to show through. That is why, in this video, we break down every major Family Guy meltdown. Meg's breakdown. Seahorse Seashell Party. Family Guy has spent more than 20 years finding new ways to make Meg Griffin the target of every joke in the house. Her father mocks her looks, her brother ignores her mother brushes her off, and even her baby brother, a toddler with a genius-level mind, treats her like she barely matters. But there was one night during a hurricane when the writers let her stop being the punching bag for a few straight minutes and just tell her family exactly what she thought of them. That episode was called Seahorse Seashell Party, and it aired on October 2nd, 2011, as the second episode of the show's 10th season. It holds a strange place in the show's history because for a short stretch, it drops the joke completely and lets a character say something that actually feels true. This section walks through how that episode came together, what happens inside it, and why people still bring it up more than a decade later. To understand why this moment landed the way it did, it helps to know what Meg's place in the family had become by that point in the show. From the very first seasons, Meg was written as the one nobody respected. She got mocked for her appearance, for her lack of a social life, for her intelligence, and for basically everything else about her. And this happened episode after episode with almost no pushback. Fans and critics gave this pattern a name over the years, describing her as the character who exists mainly to take insults, so everyone else in the house looks better by comparison. Writers on the show have talked openly over the years about how this became something viewers expected to see in nearly every single episode, almost like a running checklist item alongside Stewie's jokes about his own confused feelings and Brian's smug opinions about everything around him. By the time season 10 rolled around, this pattern had been running for close to a decade without much real change. Occasionally, the show would let Meg win something small, a moment where she got the upper hand or proved someone wrong, but those wins rarely stuck, and the family usually went right back to treating her the same way in the very next episode. This background matters a lot, because Seahorse Seashell Party does not come out of nowhere. The writers had built years of mistreatment into Meg's character, specifically so that when she finally reached her breaking point, it would carry real weight instead of feeling like a random outburst with no history behind it. The episode itself was part of a bigger event on Fox called Night of the Hurricane. This was a 3-part crossover between Family Guy, The Cleveland Show, and American Dad, all 3 shows created by Seth MacFarlane. The setup was that a single storm moves through the fictional towns where each show takes place, starting in Stool Bend, Virginia, home of The Cleveland Show, then rolling into Quahog, Rhode Island, where the Griffins live, and finally reaching Langley Falls, home of American Dad. Each show handled its own piece of the storm, with The Cleveland Show going first in an episode called The Hurricane, Family Guy taking the middle chapter with Seahorse Seashell Party, and American Dad closing things out with its own episode. Seahorse Seashell Party is the Family Guy chapter of that event, and it centers on the Griffins stuck inside their house while the storm rolls through town. There is a small piece of real history connected to when this episode actually aired. It was originally supposed to come out months earlier, on May 1st, 2011, as part of the same 3-part crossover, but just 2 days before that planned date, a massive and deadly outbreak of tornadoes tore through the southern United States, killing close to 300 people. Since the episode's whole plot revolved around a dangerous storm hitting American towns, the network pulled it from the schedule out of respect for what had just happened, and it did not actually air until October of that year instead. This delay is worth mentioning because it shows that even a show known for pushing every boundary it can find still recognized when the timing of a joke mattered. Inside the episode, the Griffin family is stuck at home as the storm bears down on Quahog. With nothing to do and no power for most of the night, they try to keep themselves entertained through a mix of games and activities, the kind of thing any family stuck indoors during bad weather might try. Running alongside this main storyline is a second plot involving Brian, the family dog, who decides to pass the time by eating psychedelic mushrooms he finds around the house. What follows for Brian is a long, strange sequence of hallucinations that grow more and more extreme, eventually leading him to accidentally cut off part of his own ear while lost in the trip. This subplot plays out mostly for shock value and dark comedy, showing wild, twisted visuals as Brian loses touch with reality, while Stewie tries to keep an eye on him and stop things from getting worse. It runs in parallel with the main story, rather than crossing into it very often, giving the episode 2 very different tones happening side by side, one chaotic and cartoonish, the other slowly building towards something much more serious. That serious side belongs entirely to Meg. As the family sits through the storm together, the old pattern starts up again almost immediately. Peter, Lois, and Chris take turns getting in jabs at her expense, the same kind of comments she has absorbed absorbed for years without much reaction. At first, it looks like another ordinary episode, the kind where Meg gets picked on and the story moves along without much consequence. But this time, something is different underneath the surface. The insults keep stacking up over the course of the night, one after another, without any of the usual breaks the show normally gives her. There is no moment where she gets to laugh it off, or where the scene cuts away to something else before it gets too heavy. The tension keeps building instead of resetting, and it becomes clear that the writers are setting up something bigger than a typical scene of Meg getting picked on. The turning point comes when the family pushes one insult too many, and Meg finally reaches her limit. She turns on her father, her mother, and her brother all at once, calling out years of the exact kind of treatment that has just been happening in front of the audience. Unlike most moments involving Meg on this show, there is no joke buried inside her reaction, and no punchline waiting to undercut what she is saying. She lays out in plain terms how she has been treated by the people who are supposed to care about her most, and for a stretch of the episode, the show simply lets her speak without cutting away or softening the moment with a gag. It is one of the very few times in the series where the show treats a character's anger as something real instead of something to laugh at. What makes this scene land is not just what Meg says, but how the show chooses to shoot it. The pacing slows down noticeably compared to the rest of the episode. The reactions from Peter, Lois, and Chris are quieter and more startled than usual, without the usual cartoon exaggeration the show relies on for its comedy. For a show that almost never lets a serious moment breathe for more than a few seconds before breaking the tension with a joke, this scene stretches out just long enough to feel uncomfortable in a way that seems intentional rather than accidental. Once Meg's outburst is out in the open, the episode does something unexpected with it. Rather than the family simply apologizing and moving on, the confrontation causes the whole household to turn on each other. Old resentments between Peter, Lois, and Chris start surfacing now that the usual target of their frustration has stopped absorbing all of it. The dynamic that had kept the family functioning, however unhealthy it was, starts to fall apart once Meg refuses to keep playing her usual role. This is where the episode makes its sharpest and most honest point, even if it never says it directly. Meg, being the constant target of the family's frustration, was never really about her. It was a pressure valve that let everyone else avoid turning on one another. Once that valve gets shut off, the family has nowhere else to put its tension, and it starts spilling out sideways instead. By the end of the episode, the show pulls back from taking this idea any further. The family dynamic more or less resets, and the household returns to a version of its usual pattern once the storm passes and life goes back to normal. This kind of ending is typical for Family Guy, a series built around a static world where very little ever permanently changes from one episode to the next. Even so, the fact that the writers were willing to spend real screen time on Meg's perspective, instead of using her only as a setup for someone else's joke, made this episode stand out from the pattern that had defined her character for years. The reception to the episode itself was mixed at best when it first aired. Critics were largely unimpressed with the episode as a whole, focusing their criticism mainly on its humor and its central plot, and it did not rank among the more celebrated episodes of that season. Ratings were also fairly modest, with the episode drawing close to 6.9 million viewers on its original broadcast, and posting a rating of 3.5 among viewers between the ages of 18 and 49, according to Nielsen numbers, a standard measurement used to track how many people in that age range were watching live television at the time. Despite this lukewarm reception overall, the sequence involving Meg has aged into something people bring up separately from the episode as a whole, treated almost like its own standalone moment, rather than just another beat in a forgettable episode. There are a few small details connected to the episode that add some extra context once you know them. The episode's odd title, Seahorse Seashell Party, was inspired by a well-known internet video from years earlier featuring a man describing a drug-induced experience involving images of seashells and seahorses, which lines up with the surreal, hallucinatory imagery used during Brian's mushroom trip later in the episode. There is also a nod buried in the visual style of Brian's hallucination sequence, which drew inspiration from a famous painting by the artist Peter Bruegel the Elder. That painting is widely known in English by the nickname Mad Meg, a detail that quietly ties back to Meg's own outburst later in the same episode, even though the connection is easy to miss unless you already know the painting's nickname going in. The episode closes with a strange, almost old-fashioned touch. Stewie appears directly, addressing the audience the way an actor might at the end of an old public service announcement from decades earlier, warning viewers that tonight's episode dealt with a serious subject and that drug use is nothing to laugh about, before making a sarcastic joke about where someone might go to learn more. This closing bit is clearly poking fun at the kind of serious, moralizing endings older television shows used to tack onto otherwise lighthearted episodes, and it is aimed squarely at Brian Ryan's storyline rather than Meg's. Even so, it adds one more layer to an episode that spends most of its runtime bouncing between broad, chaotic comedy and one genuinely heavy, unfiltered moment involving a character the show usually treats as disposable. What makes Seahorse Seashell Party worth remembering, even years later, is not really the storm, or the mushrooms, or even the crossover event it was built around. It is the handful of minutes where the show stopped hiding behind a joke and let one of its most mistreated characters say exactly what had been done to her in front of the very people who did it. The show never fully returns to that honesty again with the same character in the same way, but for that short stretch, it proved it was capable of it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every meltdown on this show comes from years of built-up anger finally spilling out into the open. Some come from something much simpler, a sudden shift in responsibility that pushes a character past what they can actually handle, with consequences that turn out to be far more serious than anyone expected. Section 2. Chris's heart attack. Trading places. Family Guy has a long history of using its own family as the punchline, but Trading Places is one of the rare episodes where the writers use that same family to make an actual point about how hard adult life really is. This episode, the 13th of season 9, aired on March 20th, 2011, and it takes a simple sitcom idea, a family swapping roles for a week, and pushes it past comedy and into a stress-induced heart attack for one of the Griffin kids. The episode was written by Steve Callahan and directed by Joseph Lee, and it stands out because it commits fully to showing what happens when a teenager suddenly has to carry the weight of being the only person paying the bills. The story starts with something small and almost silly. Peter wins a dirt bike after outlasting other contestants in a radio contest where everyone had to keep a hand on the bike for as long as possible. Excited about his prize, Peter leaves the bike at home, only for Chris and Meg to sneak out and take it for a ride without permission. The two of them end up crashing it into a ditch, wrecking the bike Peter had just won. When Peter and Lois find out what happened, they punish Chris by making him take up smoking as a strange form of discipline, and the whole situation spirals into a bigger argument about which side of the family actually has it harder, the kids or the parents. Chris and Meg insist that being a teenager is far more difficult than being an adult, while Peter and Lois argue that raising children and running a household is the real burden. Neither side is willing to back down, so the family agrees to settle the argument the only way a sitcom family would, by trading places completely for a week. Under the terms of the swap, Chris and Meg step into the roles of the parents, taking on the household duties and dressing in a more grown-up, conservative style, while Peter and Lois start attending high school as students. Meg takes over the cooking and cleaning, and Chris heads off to the brewery to work the same job his father has held for years. Meanwhile, Peter and Lois are dropped into the middle of a modern high school environment, expected to keep up with schoolwork, deal with the social pressures of being a teenager, and survive encounters with bullies, all while adjusting to a world that has changed a great deal since they were last students themselves. The early stretch of the episode plays this contrast for laughs, and at first the joke seems to be that the kids have it easier than they expected. Meg turns out to be surprisingly skilled at running a household, finishing all of the day's chores in under an hour and turning out meals good enough to impress everyone around her. Chris, meanwhile, throws himself into his father's job at the brewery and ends up doing far more work than Peter had ever bothered to put in. His effort catches the attention of his boss, a woman named Angela, who is stunned by how much better he performs compared to Peter, and rewards him with a raise almost immediately. On the other side of the swap, Peter and Lois are having the opposite experience. Both of them struggle to keep up with the demands of high school, dealing with brutal course loads, complicated social dynamics, and bullies who make their days miserable in ways neither of them expected going in. By the time the family reconvenes at home that night, the gap between the two experiences is obvious. Chris and Meg tell their parents that switching roles turned out to be much easier than they thought it would be, while Peter and Lois openly admit that they are struggling and getting picked on at school. Wanting to end the experiment early, Peter and Lois try to get their kids to return to their normal roles, and Meg is perfectly willing to go along with it. Chris, however, is not. He has just been hired at the brewery to formally replace his own father, since his performance was strong enough that Angela let Peter go and brought Chris on in his place. With his new job secured and his new status as the person actually bringing money into the household, Chris refuses to give it up, pointing out that as the one now paying for everything, he gets to make the calls about how things run in the house. This puts Peter, who had spent years insisting that being the breadwinner meant having the final say on every decision, in the awkward position of losing that same argument to his own son. With Peter now out of a job and searching for new work, the family agrees to let the arrangement continue a little longer, at least until Peter can find something else to bring in an income. This is where the episode shifts away from comedy and starts building towards something much heavier. Chris, now the sole person supporting the entire household, begins picking up extra shifts and overtime hours at the brewery recovery to keep up with the demands of his new position. The strain of this workload starts wearing him down almost immediately. He starts drinking as a way to cope with the pressure building on him, something that would have seemed unthinkable for his character just a few episodes earlier. As the stress piles up, his personality begins to shift along with it. He becomes short-tempered and harsh with the people around him, snapping at his family during arguments over money and responsibilities that he never had to think about before taking on his father's old job. This buildup culminates in a scene where Chris, worn down by weeks of overwork, drinking, and mounting financial pressure, completely loses control during another argument with his family about money. In the middle of this outburst, years of built-up stress catch up to his body all at once, and he suffers a heart attack right there in the house. For a character who spends most of the series as the dim-witted, easygoing member of the family, watching him collapse from the kind of stress usually associated with burned-out adults hits differently than most of the show's other dramatic beats. It is not framed as a joke or a passing gag. It plays out as a genuine medical emergency brought on directly by circumstances the family itself created when they agreed to the swap in the first place. Chris survives the heart attack, and once he has recovered enough to speak with his family again, something shifts in how everyone understands the situation. Chris finally admits that being an adult carries its own kind of weight that he had completely underestimated before living through it himself. And Lois, in turn, acknowledges that having a strong, supportive family around you makes a real difference when things get hard, no matter which side of the parent and child divide you happen to be standing on. By the end of the episode, Peter manages to get his old job back at the brewery, and life in the Griffin household returns to its usual order, with the parents back to being parents and the kids back to being kids. Reviews of the episode at the time were mixed, with several critics pointing out that the show seemed to lean on Chris's heart attack as a somewhat abrupt way to force the family back into its normal roles, rather than letting the story resolve more naturally. Even so, most reviewers agreed that the underlying idea behind the episode, that both children and adults tend to assume the other side has it easier, came through clearly, and that the swap gave two of the show's most overlooked characters, Chris and Meg, a rare chance to actually succeed at something without the show turning it into a joke at their expense. Behind the scenes, the episode reportedly went through the usual lengthy production process for the series, with the full script finalized months before it aired, following several rounds of group rewrites focused on timing and how well individual jokes landed. The heart attack subplot was included specifically as a way to add real stakes to what could have otherwise been a fairly simple swapped roles storyline, giving the episode a dramatic edge that grounded the more exaggerated comedy happening around Peter and Lois at the high school. The episode aired as the season's 13th installment as part of Fox's broader order of 18 episodes for that season, following a production timeline that stretched across roughly a year from the earliest scripts to the finished aired episode. What makes this particular Meltdown different from most of the ones the show has produced over the years is where the stress actually comes from. It is not built out of years of mistreatment finally boiling over, and it is not the result of some outside force pushing a character past their limits from the outside. It comes from something much closer to real life, the simple and very common experience of taking on more responsibility than a person is prepared to handle, and letting that pressure build silently until the body itself gives out under the strain. Chris never set out to prove a point or make some grand statement about adulthood. He just kept saying yes to more work, more hours, and more pressure right up until his body forced him to stop. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Some meltdowns in this family come from stress quietly piling up until something finally gives way. Others come from something far darker sitting underneath a person for years, a secret buried so deep that even the people closest to them never saw it coming until the moment it all breaks open. Section 3. Patrick's Confession, the Fat Guy Strangler. Family Guy has introduced plenty of one-time characters over the years, but few of them carry as much twisted family history as Patrick Pewterschmidt, the long-lost brother Lois Griffin never even knew existed. His story unfolds in the episode The Fat Guy Strangler, the 17th episode of the show's 4th season, which aired on November 27th, 2005. This episode arrived during an important stretch in the show's history, since Family Guy had actually been canceled back in 2002 after low ratings during its second season, only to be brought back a few years later thanks to strong DVD sales and heavy reruns on Cartoon Network's late-night programming block. Season 4 marked the show's full return to Fox, and this episode is a good example of how the writers used that fresh start to push into darker, stranger territory than the earlier seasons had gone. The episode opens with two separate stories running side by side, one comedic and one that slowly turns into something far more disturbing. On the lighter side, Peter goes in for a routine checkup with Dr. Hartman and learns that he is, by medical standards, standards, overweight. Rather than take this news as a reason to change anything about his lifestyle, Peter decides the real problem is how society treats overweight people, and he sets out to build a support group and advocacy organization for men in his position. This group becomes known as the National Association for the Advancement of Fat People, and Peter throws himself into it with the same overblown enthusiasm he brings to most of his projects throughout the series. This storyline gives the episode its lighter, more typical Family Guy tone in the early stretches, filled with exaggerated jokes about size, self-image, and Peter's usual lack of self-awareness. The second storyline starts almost by accident. While going about her day, Lois stumbles across an old family photograph that reveals something she never knew about her own past. Tucked away and partially hidden in the picture is evidence that she has an older brother, someone she has never met and never even heard mentioned by anyone in her family. When she brings this discovery to her father, he denies it outright and refuses to explain anything about who this person might be or why he has been kept a secret for her entire life. Rather than let the matter drop, Lois decides to dig further on her own, eventually tracking down enough information to learn where her long-lost brother has been living all these years. What she finds is difficult to hear. Her brother, a man named Patrick, has spent his entire life locked away inside a mental institution, hidden from Lois and the rest of the family without her knowledge or consent. When Lois finally meets him in person, Patrick comes across as calm, friendly, and reasonably well-adjusted, someone who seems far more like an ordinary person than the kind of patient one might expect to find inside a facility like that. He does have one noticeably strange habit, treating an invisible woman named Marion as though she were his actual wife, speaking to her, defending her, and acting as if she is standing right there in the room with him. Despite this one visible quirk, Lois comes away from the visit convinced that her brother does not belong locked away from the world, and she makes the decision to have him released so he can come live with her and the rest of the Griffin family. As Patrick settles into life with the Griffins, the show slowly reveals the deeper reason behind why he was ever institutionalized in the first place. As a very young child, Patrick witnessed something that permanently damaged his sense of safety and trust in the world around him. He saw his own mother in an intimate moment with the comedian and actor Jackie Gleason, a scene that left him so emotionally scarred that it fundamentally warped the way his mind processed the world from that point forward. The specific detail of Gleason's involvement becomes the psychological trigger buried deep inside Patrick's memory, something that stayed dormant for years, as long as nothing ever brought that particular trauma back to the surface. Unfortunately for everyone involved, Peter turns out to be exactly the kind of person capable of accidentally triggering that exact memory. In one of the episode's key turning points, Peter, unaware of the damage he is about to cause, imitates Gleason directly in front of Patrick, mimicking his mannerisms and appearance in a way that instantly drags Patrick's mind back to the traumatic moment from his childhood. This single interaction acts like a switch being flipped inside him. From that point forward, Patrick begins targeting and killing overweight men across the town of Quahog, strangling his victims in a series of murders that quickly earn him the nickname the Fat Guy Strangler in local news coverage. Many of his victims turn out to be members of Peter's own newly formed advocacy group, meaning the very organization Peter created to protect and celebrate overweight men in the community ends up supplying his own family's secret killer with a steady stream of targets. As the murders continue and fear spreads through the fat advocacy group Peter has built, Lois refuses to believe that her newly reunited brother could possibly be responsible for what is happening. Even as evidence mounts and Brian, the family dog, tries repeatedly to convince her that Patrick is the one behind the killings, Lois stays firmly in denial, unwilling to accept that the brother she just found again could be capable of something this violent. This denial continues even as Peter, terrified for his own safety and the safety of the other men in his group, starts bringing them back to his own house in an attempt to protect them from whatever danger is stalking the town. The truth finally becomes impossible to ignore when Brian leads Lois directly to Patrick's room inside the house and shows her what he has found hidden there. Inside are disturbing signs of exactly what Patrick has been doing, including evidence connected to several of his victims, some of them already dead, and others left in critical condition. Confronted with this physical proof laid out in front of her, Lois can no longer hold on to her denial. She finally accepts that her brother is the one responsible for the murders terrorizing the town, and worse, she realizes that Peter himself could be in serious danger if Patrick is not stopped immediately. This realization sets up the episode's final confrontation. Lois and Brian rush out to find Peter, tracking him and Patrick into the woods outside of town, where they arrive just in time to see Patrick in the middle of strangling Peter with his bare hands. With her husband's life hanging in the balance, Lois has to think think fast, and she finds an unusual way to break through to her brother in the middle of his violent episode. Knowing that Patrick's imaginary wife, Marion, means everything to him, despite the fact that no one else can see or interact with her, Lois threatens to harm this invisible figure unless Patrick lets Peter go. The threat works immediately. Patrick releases his grip on Peter the moment he believes Marion might be in danger, snapping out of whatever violent state had taken hold of him just moments before. What happens next is the true emotional core of the entire episode, and the moment this section has been building toward. Once Patrick lets go of Peter and the immediate danger passes, the anger and violence drain out of him almost instantly, replaced by something closer to shame and heartbreak. He turns to Lois, visibly shaken by what he has just done, and offers her a genuine apology, telling her that hurting her or the people she cares about was never something he wanted or intended. This is not played as a twist meant to excuse his actions or make the murders seem less serious. It plays instead as a raw, honest moment where a deeply damaged man finally confronts the reality of what his trauma has turned him into, standing in front of the one family member who was willing to give him a chance at a normal life after decades of being hidden away and forgotten. Following this confession, Patrick and Lois come to an understanding together. He accepts that he needs to go back to the mental institution where he had been living before Lois found him, recognizing on some level that he cannot safely remain outside its walls, given what he is capable of when the wrong memory gets triggered. Lois, despite everything that has happened, does not turn her back on him completely. She commits to keeping him in her life even after he returns to the facility, and the two agree that she and the rest of the Griffin family will visit him on a regular basis going forward, treating him as family rather than simply writing him off as a monster to be locked away and forgotten a second time. This closing exchange between the two of them is frequently pointed to as one of the more genuinely touching moments buried inside an otherwise dark and morbid storyline, since it shows real, unresolved love between two siblings, despite one of them carrying an unspeakable secret. The character of Patrick did not disappear from the show entirely after this episode. He returned years later in the 10th season in an episode called Killer Queen, where a brand new string of murders bearing the exact same signature as the original Fat Guy Strangler killings begins terrorizing the town all over again. Given his history, Patrick immediately becomes the prime suspect once more, with the family and the police naturally assuming he must have either escaped or somehow found a way to continue his old pattern of violence. This time, however, the story flips the earlier premise on its head. Patrick turns out to be completely innocent of these particular killings, and rather than being the villain of the story a second time, he actually plays a key role in helping stop the real culprit before the situation escalates into another family tragedy. This return appearance gave the character an unexpected layer of redemption, allowing him to prove that whatever violence lives inside him because of his childhood trauma does not define every version of who he is capable of being. When the original episode first aired, it received a solid reception from both critics and general audiences, eventually earning a strong average rating from viewers who rated it well after watching. Much of the praise focused on how effectively the show managed to blend dark, uncomfortable subject matter with its usual style of humor without letting either side completely overwhelm the other. Critics in particular pointed to the way the episode handled its satire around prejudice toward overweight people through Peter's advocacy group storyline, treating a real-world issue with a surprising amount of sharpness hidden underneath the absurd comedy surrounding it. The voice performance behind Patrick himself, provided by the actor Robert Downey Jr. in a rare guest appearance on the show, was also highlighted as a major strength of the episode, with reviewers noting how well he captured a personality that felt believably unstable without tipping over into pure cartoon villainy. Some criticism did surface as well, mostly aimed at the frequent use of unrelated cutaway jokes throughout the episode, a signature style choice for the series that occasionally pulled focus away from the more serious central story involving Lois and her brother. What makes Patrick's breakdown different from the other meltdowns covered so far in this look at the show's history is where the damage actually originates. Meg's outburst came from years of daily mistreatment finally reaching its breaking point. Chris's heart attack came from the sudden, overwhelming weight of adult responsibility landing on him all at once. Patrick's collapse comes from something buried far deeper and much older than either of those situations. A single traumatic childhood memory that sat dormant inside him for decades before being accidentally reactivated by someone who had absolutely no idea what he was setting into motion. His story is less about pressure building up over time and more about a wound that never properly healed in the first place, one that stayed hidden and dangerous long after everyone around him assumed it was safely locked away and forgotten. The episode also stands out because it refuses to give its ending a clean, comfortable resolution. Patrick does not get cured of whatever trauma reshaped his mind as a child, and the show makes makes no attempt to pretend that a single confrontation in the woods magically fixes what decades of isolation and untreated pain had done to him. He simply returns to the same institution he came from, carrying the same damage he always carried, only now with one person on the outside who knows the truth about him and has chosen not to abandon him because of it. That decision by Lois to keep showing up for a brother capable of real violence gives the episode an emotional complexity that goes beyond most of the show's usual storylines, where conflicts tend to wrap up neatly by the time the credits roll. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next breakdown in this family does not come from years of mistreatment or a body giving out under pressure. It starts somewhere else entirely, inside the mind of a 4-year-old who is suddenly forced to understand that nobody, not even him, gets to live forever. Section 4. Stewie's Fear of Death. Mom's the Word. This breakdown does not come from mistreatment, overwork, or a trauma buried since childhood. It comes from something much smaller and much stranger, a single piece of information landing on a 4-year-old mind that was never built to carry it. The plain fact that every living thing eventually dies. This happens in the episode Mom's the Word, the 12th episode of the show's 12th season, which aired on March 9th, 2014. It was directed by John Holmquist and written by Ted Jessup. And while the main story focuses on Peter dealing with a death in his own family, the smaller storyline running underneath it is what makes this episode stand out from most of the show's other entries. The episode begins with a rough morning for Peter. He eats an entire tube of raw cookie dough at home, mistaking it for something else, and later that day the consequences of that mistake catch up to him during an important meeting at the Pawtucket Brewery where he works. Unable to leave the room in time, Peter has an accident in front of his coworkers, a humiliating moment that leaves him exhausted and low by the time he finally makes it home. He expects more teasing when he arrives, since that is usually how his day ends after something embarrassing happens to him. Instead, he is met with much heavier news. His mother, Thelma Griffin, has died of a stroke. This piece of news shifts the entire tone of the episode, moving it away from the earlier embarrassment and into something far more serious involving real loss inside the family. Following Thelma's death, the family gathers for her funeral. It is here that the second, quieter storyline of the episode starts to take shape. Stewie, who is still technically a baby according to the show's internal timeline, despite having the vocabulary and intelligence of someone far older, asks questions about what is happening around him. While trying to explain the situation, Brian tells Stewie something that had apparently never fully registered with him before, that everyone eventually dies, and that this applies to Stewie just as much as it applies to Thelma or to anyone else. For most young children, and honestly for most people generally, this kind of statement can pass by without leaving much of a mark, especially at a funeral where such things are naturally being discussed. For Stewie, whose mind works at a level far beyond his physical age, the idea lands with the full weight of something he is now fully capable of understanding, and it becomes very difficult for him to simply set it aside and move on with his day. That night, the impact of this new understanding becomes obvious almost right away. Stewie finds himself completely unable to sleep, lying awake with his thoughts locked onto the idea that his own life has a definite endpoint somewhere out in his future. Eventually, he admits to Brian, without any of his usual sharp or sarcastic tone, that he is afraid of dying. This kind of open, unguarded fear is rare for his character, and it signals to the audience that this is not just another passing joke about Stewie's exaggerated intelligence. Brian, taking the situation seriously, decides to try to help Stewie work through what he is feeling, rather than simply dismissing it. Brian's method for trying to help involves taking Stewie on something like a tour through different religious beliefs, hoping that one of them might offer him some kind of answer or comfort about what happens after a person dies. The two of them visit a Jewish synagogue, the Quahog Buddhist temple, and a Catholic church, listening to what each tradition teaches about death and what, if anything, comes afterward. Despite hearing several different perspectives on the subject, Stewie remains unsatisfied by all of them. None of the answers he receives manage to ease the fear that has taken hold of him since the funeral, and he continues pushing for something more concrete than what any of these visits are able to give him. Frustrated by the lack of a satisfying answer, Stewie eventually turns directly to Brian and asks him plainly what he personally believes happens after a person dies. This question puts Brian in an interesting position, since earlier storylines in the show had already shown him going to heaven and even meeting Jesus Christ in person on more than one occasion during previous episodes. Despite this personal history, Brian answers Stewie honestly according to his own long-standing worldview, telling him that he believes nothing happens after death, reflecting the same non-believing outlook Brian has expressed throughout much of the series, regardless of what he may have personally experienced in earlier storylines. Rather than offering Stewie any comfort, this blunt answer makes things considerably worse. Stewie is left with the belief that death simply ends everything completely, with nothing waiting on the other side. And this idea pushes him into a much darker place than simple nighttime anxiety about mortality. From here, the episode moves into territory that is unusually dark for the series, even by its own standards of pushing boundaries for shock value. Convinced that life is essentially just a countdown toward an empty ending, Stewie begins actively trying to end his own life, rather than continue waiting for death to eventually catch up with him on its own. He first attempts to hang himself, though this attempt fails without causing him any real harm. He then tries putting himself in the path of a police officer by shooting out the back window of a parked police cruiser, hoping to provoke a fatal response from the officer inside. This attempt is interrupted by Joe, the family's paraplegic police officer friend, who steps outside to confront Stewie directly. Rather than reacting with alarm, Joe responds to the situation with a strange kind of detached honesty, at one point revealing that he is not wearing his usual protective vest, and, in a darkly comic twist, essentially inviting Stewie to shoot him instead in a flat, unfeeling tone, which stops the moment from playing out the way Stewie intended. Stewie also tries a much stranger method, dropping a toaster into a bathtub in an attempt to end his own life through electric shock. But instead of causing any harm, this incident inexplicably gives him a temporary set of superpowers, a purely comedic beat dropped into the middle of an otherwise heavy storyline. The turning point in this storyline comes when Brian finds Stewie standing at the edge of an open window in his room, clearly preparing to jump.
This is the moment the whole subplot has been building toward, and it plays out with more seriousness than the earlier suicide attempts, which had each carried a layer of dark comedy underneath them. Brian steps in and stops Stewie before he can go through with it, telling him that he should not be so afraid of continuing to live in the present moment, rather than fixating entirely on an ending that has not arrived yet. This moment marks the second time in the series that Brian has personally stopped Stewie from attempting to take his own life, with the first instance having occurred years earlier in an episode called Killer Queen, which also happens to be the same episode where Patrick Pewterschmidt returned to clear his name in connection with a new string of murders following the events covered earlier in this look at the show's history.
Brian stopping Stewie a second time in this later episode suggests that Stewie's relationship with the idea of his own mortality is not something the show treats as a single resolved event, but rather something that resurfaces more than once across different points in the series. Following this intervention, the episode shifts back towards something closer to its usual comedic tone to close out the storyline. Stewie considers taking up songwriting as a possible creative outlet, and Brian, clearly humoring him rather than genuinely encouraging the idea, hesitates before eventually agreeing to sit through Stewie's attempt at a performance. When Stewie actually begins singing, however, Brian finds himself unable to get through it, and in a dark joke that closes the loop on the entire storyline, he tells Stewie that he should go ahead and end his life after all, reversing the message he had delivered just moments earlier at the window. This closing exchange returns the storyline fully to comedy, using dark humor to wrap up a plotline that had spent much of its runtime dealing honestly with grief, fear, and the psychological weight of confronting death for the first time. Running alongside Stewie's storyline, the main plot of the episode follows Peter as he processes the loss of his mother. Following the funeral, Thelma's close friend Evelyn, voiced by the actress Lauren Bacall in what turned out to be her final television role, comes to comfort Peter during this difficult time. The relationship between the two of them takes an awkward turn when Evelyn, despite the age difference and the strange circumstances surrounding their meeting, ends up kissing Peter, creating uncomfortable tension between them as the episode continues. This storyline provides much of the episode's more conventional comedy, contrasting with the heavier, more introspective material happening in Stewie's parallel storyline involving Brian. Critics and fans who discussed the episode after it aired frequently pointed to the handling of Stewie's fear of death as one of the more surprisingly thoughtful moments the show had produced by that point in its run. Several observers noted that Brian's decision to take Stewie seriously, walking him through multiple religious perspectives rather than simply mocking his fear or brushing it aside, reflected a noticeably more mature version of Brian compared to how the character had often been written in earlier seasons of the show. This shift stood out specifically because Brian's character had, in many earlier episodes, leaned heavily into cynicism and dismissiveness toward other characters' feelings, making his patience with Stewie throughout this particular storyline feel like a meaningful departure from that established pattern, even if the episode ultimately chose to end the arc with a joke rather than a fully resolved emotional conclusion. What makes this particular meltdown distinct from the others already covered is the size of the trigger behind it. Meg's outburst came after years years of accumulated mistreatment. Chris's collapse came from the sudden, crushing weight of adult responsibility landing on him all at once. Patrick's violent episodes came from a single, traumatic memory buried since early childhood, waiting years before finally resurfacing. Stewie's breakdown, by comparison, comes from nothing more than a plain, unavoidable fact being spoken aloud in front of him for what seems to be the first time in a way he could not simply ignore or reason his way around. There is no history of abuse behind it, no external pressure pushing him toward collapse, and no long-buried secret suddenly coming to light. It is simply the basic truth of mortality landing on a mind sharp enough to fully grasp what that truth actually means, with no earlier version of himself having built up any defenses against it.
The episode also reinforces something the show has quietly established across multiple entries involving Stewie, which is that his advanced intelligence does not protect him from ordinary human fears in the way it might seem to on the surface. If anything, his capacity to understand ideas like mortality on a deep adult level appears to make the experience worse rather than easier for him, since he lacks the emotional maturity or life experience that might normally help someone process such a heavy realization. He understands the concept of death with total clarity, yet he still reacts to it with the same fear, panic, and desperate searching for answers that any frightened child might show when confronted with something far bigger than they know how to handle. This gap between his intellectual understanding and his emotional readiness is really what drives the entire storyline, more so than the subject of death itself. By the time the episode ends, the show pulls back once again to its usual balance of comedy over lingering seriousness, closing Stewie's arc with a joke rather than any kind of lasting resolution to his fear of death. This pattern lines up with how Family Guy generally handles its heavier storylines, allowing a character to move through something genuinely difficult before resetting things back to a more familiar tone by the time the credits roll. Even so, the fact that this particular fear resurfaces again later in the show, with Brian once more having to step in to stop Stewie from acting on it, suggests that this was not treated as a single, isolated event confined entirely to one episode, but rather as something sitting quietly underneath the character that occasionally rises back up under the right circumstances. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Some meltdowns in this family come from a mind understanding too much too quickly. The next one comes from the opposite direction entirely, a mind trying to escape boredom by chasing a feeling it never expected to lose control over so fast. Section 5. Brian's Addiction, the Thin White Line. Brian Griffin has spent most of Family Guy's run playing the role of the family's most self-aware character, the one who reads novels, quotes philosophy, and looks down on almost everyone around him for not thinking as deeply as he believes he does. The episode, The Thin White Line, strips away that image for a while and shows what happens when Brian goes looking for a sense of purpose and finds something that nearly destroys him instead. This episode aired on July 11th, 2001, as the very first episode of the show's third season, and it holds a special place in the series' history for a reason that has nothing to do with its plot. Family Guy had actually been canceled after its second season due to low ratings, and this episode marked the moment the show came back from that cancellation for the first time, making it the episode that quietly proved the series still had an audience worth bringing back for. The story begins with Brian in a low place, though not because of anything dramatic happening to him. He tells his therapist that he feels stuck in a kind of emotional rut, unsure of what he is doing with his life or what any of it is building toward. His therapist offers a fairly ordinary piece of advice, suggesting that Brian might be spending too much time focused inward on his own problems, and that doing something for other people, some kind of volunteer work, could help pull him out of the mental space he has been stuck in. Brian takes this advice seriously and starts volunteering as a guide dog for blind and elderly people around Quahog, using his abilities in a way that genuinely seems to help him feel a bit more useful and connected to the world around him. This volunteer work eventually leads him somewhere much bigger than he expected. Joe, the family's close friend who works as a police officer, despite having lost the use of his legs years earlier, notices just how strong Brian's sense of smell really is and offers him the chance to work as a drug-sniffing dog for the Quahog Police Department. For a character who has spent so much of the show feeling overlooked and underestimated by everyone around him, this offer represents something Brian has clearly been missing: a real sense of purpose tied to a skill he actually has and a job that matters to the people around him. He accepts almost immediately, eager for the chance to prove himself in a role that finally uses his talents for something concrete. Brian's first day on the job takes place at the airport, and it starts off as an immediate success. Using his nose, he manages to track down a suitcase filled with cocaine, an impressive result for someone brand new to the position. In the process of making this discovery, however, Brian accidentally
exposes himself to a small amount of the drug himself. What starts as an accidental moment quickly turns into something much bigger as the episode continues. Rather than treating this incident as a one-time mistake to move past, Brian keeps returning to the feeling it gave him, and the show starts tracking his slow but steady slide into addiction as his time on the police force continues. For a while, Brian's success on the job and his growing personal problem seem to move forward side by side, without one obviously canceling out the other. He continues performing well in his role, helping police officers catch numerous drug traffickers, and becoming something of a local celebrity for his effectiveness at the job. At one point, he is even given a nickname at a school assembly, referred to as a kind of drug-fighting mascot, in a nod to the real-world anti-drug campaigns that were common at the time. On the surface, everything about Brian's new career looks like exactly the kind of success story his therapist had hoped volunteer work might lead him toward. Underneath that surface, though, his personal relationship with the very substance he is supposed to be helping remove from the streets keeps getting worse, even as his professional reputation keeps climbing. Running alongside this main storyline is a smaller, much lighter plot involving Peter. He attends a company picnic held by the Happy-Go-Lucky Toy Company, where he wins a challenge organized by a man named Mr. Weed, earning himself a full week of paid vacation as the prize. Excited about this reward, Peter starts planning a family cruise to the Bahamas, treating the trip as a well-earned reward for himself and a fun getaway for the rest of the family. This subplot exists mostly to set up a contrast with what is happening to Brian, since the family's excitement over the planned vacation ends up getting completely overshadowed by the seriousness of what Brian is going through at home. As Brian's addiction deepens, it eventually becomes impossible for the rest of the family to keep ignoring what is happening to him. He begins showing up at the house visibly under the influence, no longer able to hide the toll his habit has taken on him. Faced with this reality, the Griffin family makes the decision to step in directly, staging a full intervention in an attempt to confront Brian about what he has become and convince him to get help before things get any worse. During this intervention, even young Stewie, who usually treats most family drama with detached sarcasm rather than genuine concern, gets in a sharp remark aimed at Brian as he breaks down emotionally in front of everyone. A small but telling detail that shows just how far Brian's condition has progressed by this point, given that even the household's usual source of biting jokes cannot resist commenting on how far he has fallen. Confronted directly by the people closest to him, Brian finally admits that he has developed a genuine addiction to cocaine, a confession that marks a real turning point in the episode's tone. Up until this moment, the show had largely played Brian's growing habit for dark comedy, treating it as an absurd twist for a character who normally prides himself on being smarter and more self-controlled than everyone around him. Once he actually admits the truth out loud, though, the storyline shifts into something closer to a genuine, if still comedic, portrayal of what an intervention actually looks like inside a family that cares about the person struggling, even if that family happens to include a sarcastic toddler and a father who barely understands what addiction even means. Brian agrees to check himself into a rehabilitation clinic, a decision that comes with a real cost for the rest of the family, since Lois insists that the planned Bahamas cruise be cancelled so everyone can stay behind and support Brian through his treatment instead. This decision devastates Peter, who had been looking forward to the trip ever since winning it at the company picnic, and his disappointment over losing the vacation becomes its own small source of tension within the household, even as everyone tries to focus on helping Brian recover. Rather than simply staying home and accepting the canceled trip, Peter decides to insert himself directly into Brian's recovery process by tagging along with him to the rehabilitation clinic itself, drawn in partly by the clinic's impressive facilities and partly by his usual inability to stay out of situations that do not really involve him. Once there, Peter tries to check himself in under a fake identity, coming up with a name by randomly describing objects he happens to see around him at the moment, a method that quickly falls apart when he accidentally blurts out his real name in the middle of the process. Despite this obvious slip, Peter manages to stick around the facility regardless, and his presence there quickly starts causing problems for everyone involved, including Brian himself. As Peter continues acting the way he normally does, drawing attention to himself and creating chaos wherever he goes, the clinic's head doctor eventually takes notice and begins to suspect that Peter's presence might actually be undermining Brian's recovery rather than supporting it. Deciding that Peter represents a serious risk to Brian's progress, the doctor labels him as a disruptive influence, responsible for pulling Brian away from the seriousness of his treatment, essentially blaming Peter for making Brian's situation worse instead of better. Brian, despite everything that has happened, refuses to accept this framing of his best friend and defends Peter directly to the doctor, ultimately deciding to walk out of the rehabilitation clinic in protest rather than continue treatment somewhere that treats treats Peter as the enemy.
The two of them return home together, and the rest of the family, relieved to see Brian back and apparently doing better, welcomes him with a small celebration to mark his return. Just as things seem to be settling back into a normal rhythm, Brian delivers a piece of news that catches everyone off guard. He tells the family that his experience over the past several weeks, from his time on the police force through his addiction and his stay at the clinic, has taught him that every person is ultimately responsible for shaping their own path in life, and that he now feels the need to step away from Quahog entirely in order to figure out who he really is outside of the family and the town he has always known.
Without much further explanation, Brian hails a cab, gets inside, and drives off, leaving the Griffin standing there as the episode closes with a message indicating that the story will continue in the next episode, setting up the second half of what was originally broadcast as a two-part storyline. This decision to end the episode on such an open, unresolved note was intentional, since the Thin White Line was designed from the start to connect directly into the following episode, titled Brian Does Hollywood, which picks up immediately where this one leaves off and follows Brian as he tries to build a new life for himself away from the family that has always defined his identity up to this point. Taken together, the two episodes form a larger story about Brian's search for meaning, starting with a therapist's simple suggestion to try volunteering, and ending with him abandoning everything familiar in pursuit of some undefined version of independence he believes he needs to find on his own. Looking back at this episode, what stands out most is how naturally Brian's addiction grows out of something that starts as an entirely reasonable and even admirable decision. He is not chasing danger or rebellion when this story begins. He is simply a character who feels stuck and takes genuine, sincere steps to fix that feeling. First, through honest volunteer work, and then through a job that finally gives him a real sense of purpose and skill. His downfall does not come from recklessness or bad intentions. It comes from a single, accidental exposure, early in a job he is otherwise excelling at. One small moment that quietly reshapes everything that follows. This detail is part of what makes the episode land as more than just a shock value gag about a talking dog developing a drug problem. It plays instead as a story about how good intentions and real talent can still lead someone into serious trouble if the wrong circumstance crosses their path at the wrong time. The episode also uses Peter's presence at the rehabilitation clinic to say something quieter about loyalty within the family, even if it delivers that message through absurd comedy rather than anything overtly serious. Despite being blamed directly by a medical professional for damaging Brian's chances at recovery, Brian chooses his friendship with Peter over the structured environment of the clinic, walking away from treatment rather than accepting a version of recovery that requires cutting Peter out of his life. Whether or not this decision reflects good judgment on Brian's part is left deliberately unclear, and the show does not pretend that leaving rehab in this way represents any kind of triumphant moment. It simply shows Brian making a choice rooted in loyalty, even when that loyalty complicates his own path toward getting better. Audience and critical reaction to this episode has remained largely positive over the years, with many longtime fans pointing to it as an example of the sharper, more character-driven writing that defined the show's earlier seasons, before it leaned more heavily into unrelated cutaway jokes in later years. Viewers who revisited the episode years later often noted how differently Brian and Stewie were written during this period compared to their later portrayals, with Brian's arc here treated as something closer to an actual character study built around identity and purpose, wrapped inside the show's usual absurd comedic style, rather than replaced by it entirely. The mix of genuine emotional stakes with over-the-top humor, such as Peter's chaotic behavior inside the clinic or Stewie's sharp one-liners during the family's intervention, was frequently cited as a strong example of the balance the show was able to strike at this particular point in its run. What separates this meltdown from the others already covered is the fact that Brian's collapse never gets a full, satisfying conclusion within the episode itself. Meg's outburst forces her family to confront years of mistreatment directly. Chris's heart attack forces a clear return to the family's original roles. Patrick's episode ends with an apology and an ongoing connection to Lois despite his violence. Stewie's fear of death gets undercut by a joke that closes the loop on his storyline. Brian's addiction, by contrast, ends with him simply leaving, unresolved, and still searching for something he cannot fully name, setting up an entire additional episode just to continue working through what this one started. His meltdown is the only one on this list that does not really end by the time the credits roll. It just changes shape and keeps moving forward into whatever comes next. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Some meltdowns in this family come from a personal habit that quietly takes over someone's life, piece by piece. The next one comes from two very different personalities getting trapped together in a space with no way out, forced to say things to each other that neither of them would ever bring up under normal circumstances.
Section 6. Brian and Stewie's Vault Confession. Brian and Stewie.
Most episodes of Family Guy jump between dozens of characters, random cutaway jokes, and quick scene changes that rarely stay in one place for very long. Brian and Stewie throws that entire format out completely. This episode, the 17th of the show's 8th season, aired on May 2nd, 2010, and it locks its two most talkative characters inside a single room for the entire half hour, stripping away every one of the show's usual tricks in the process. There are no cutaway gags, no background music, no flashbacks, and no other characters beyond Brian and Stewie themselves. Even Peter, who normally appears in nearly every episode regardless of the plot, is never once mentioned during the entire runtime. For a show built almost entirely around chaotic pacing and constant interruptions, this episode stands out as something the writers clearly built to be different on purpose. The story starts with something completely ordinary.
Brian and Stewie head to their local bank in Quahog so that Brian can deposit some money into his personal safe deposit box, a small errand that gives no early hint of how the rest of the day is going to unfold. While they are still inside the vault, Stewie mentions wanting to head somewhere else afterward to return an expensive sweater he had bought earlier. Neither of them pays much attention to the time, and before they realize what is happening, the heavy vault door swings shut at the end of the business day, sealing them both inside without anyone else around to notice or help. The panic sets in almost immediately, and it takes a distinctly undignified form. Frightened by being trapped, Stewie has an accident in his diaper, and the situation only grows worse from there. Worried that sitting in a dirty diaper will give him a rash, Stewie becomes desperate enough to threaten Brian with a gun that Brian happens to keep stored inside his own safe deposit box, forcing Brian into an extremely unpleasant position in order to avoid being shot. This early stretch of the episode plays almost entirely for shock value and gross-out comedy, setting a tone that seems, at first, like it might carry through the rest of the episode without much depth behind it. As the hours drag on with no way out, Brian and Stewie start looking for ways to pass the time inside the vault. They find a bottle of scotch that Brian had also stored away, and drinking it leads to increasingly reckless behavior between the two of them, including a moment where the two of them, clearly not thinking clearly after drinking, decide to use a sharp pin to pierce Stewie's ear, an attempt that goes wrong immediately and ends up tearing his earlobe instead of creating a clean piercing. Stewie also has a working phone with him during this stretch, but rather than using its limited battery life to call for help, he wastes it by trying to reach a clothing store to handle the earlier issue with his sweater, a decision that leaves the two of them with even fewer options once they realize just how much trouble they are actually in. The tone of the episode begins to shift once the initial shock and chaos of being trapped start to wear off, and the two characters are left with nothing to do but talk to each other directly, without any of the usual distractions the show typically relies on to break up a conversation. This stretch of the episode draws heavily from a very specific piece of inspiration.
According to the people who created it, the entire premise was built around an old episode of the classic sitcom All in the Family, in which two characters get locked inside a storeroom together, drink alcohol, and slowly start revealing their deepest personal secrets to one another as the night goes on. Family Guy borrows this exact structure almost directly, using the isolated setting to force Brian and Stewie into the kind of honest conversation neither of them would ever have chosen to have under normal circumstances. The next morning, after sobering up from the drinking the night before, Stewie asks Brian a question that ends up cutting much deeper than either of them probably expected going into it. Curious about the gun sitting inside Brian's safe deposit box, Stewie asks him directly why he even owns one in the first place.
Rather than brushing the question off with a joke, which would fit Brian's usual defensive style whenever a conversation gets uncomfortable, Brian actually answers honestly. He admits that he keeps the gun specifically in case he ever reaches a point where he decides he no longer wants to keep living, revealing to Stewie that he has been quietly carrying thoughts about ending his own life for some time, hidden underneath the confident, intellectual personality he shows to the rest of the family. Brian goes on to explain what has been driving these feelings, telling Stewie that the weight of everyday life has become genuinely difficult for him to carry, and that Stewie had actually been right in an earlier moment during their time locked together, when he pointed out that Brian seems to be living without any real sense of direction or purpose. Brian admits that he has struggled for a long time to find any real meaning behind what he does each day, and that the scotch they had been drinking the night before was something he specifically intended to be his very last drink before following through on
ending his life. This is a significant and heavy admission for a character who spends most of the series hiding behind sarcasm, intellectual superiority, and a general sense of detachment from everyone around him, including Stewie, who he usually treats more like an annoying younger sibling than someone he would ever open up to about something this personal. Stewie, caught off guard by what Brian has just told him, asks a direct follow-up question, wondering whether their original visit to the bank that day had secretly been connected to Brian's plan to end his life. Brian clarifies that this specific trip actually had nothing to do with that, explaining that he had simply been depositing money into a savings account he keeps set aside for the holidays. This detail matters because it shows that whatever Brian has been carrying inside him has not fully taken over every part of his life. He is still someone capable of planning for the future in small, ordinary ways, like saving money ahead of the holidays, even while quietly holding on to much darker thoughts underneath the surface. What happens next becomes the emotional turning point of the entire episode. Rather than responding with fear or discomfort at what Brian has just revealed, Stewie tells him something that neither of them had ever said to each other so plainly before. He tells Brian that Brian is genuinely his only real friend, admitting this despite all of the fighting, insults, and general tension that had defined much of their relationship, not just earlier in this episode, but across many earlier moments in the series as a whole. Stewie goes further, telling Brian that he means far more to him than either of them usually let on, and that Brian actually gives his own life a sense of purpose, flipping the earlier conversation about meaning and direction back onto their relationship with each other, rather than leaving it as something only Brian struggles with alone. Stewie closes out this exchange by offering a simple, quiet observation about what actually makes life worth continuing, suggesting that it can be enough just to make one other person happy, without needing some grand, defined sense of purpose behind everything a person does. This idea lands as a surprisingly gentle conclusion, coming from a character usually defined by scheming, sarcasm, and violent fantasies aimed at his own mother. After sharing this moment together, Stewie asks Brian if he will read to him, and Brian agrees, settling into reading aloud as the two of them wind down from everything that has just passed between them. The episode closes on a quiet, understated note the following morning, when the vault door finally opens after the bank reopens for business. Rather than rushing out or making a scene, Brian is shown carrying a sleeping Stewie along with their belongings out of the vault in complete silence, a visual that mirrors the quiet, intimate tone the second half of the episode had settled into after the earlier chaos of the night before. There is no big speech, no dramatic music, and no final joke tacked onto the ending to undercut what had just happened between the two characters. The episode simply lets the moment be what it is and moves on. Behind the scenes, the people responsible for creating this episode have spoken about how differently it was built compared to a typical episode of the series. Because both Brian and Stewie are voiced by the same actor, the very first table read of the script was reportedly just that one performer speaking both roles for the entire half hour, essentially carrying on a full conversation with himself for the length of the episode. One of the show's writers has described the episode as unusually philosophical for the series, noting that it managed to combine real dark moments with genuine humor in a way that felt distinct from most of the show's other episodes. According to the producer who helped come up with the concept, the idea was directly inspired by a shared appreciation for All in the Family, with the bank vault setting specifically designed to strip away every one of the show's usual tools and force its two lead characters into an actual conversation instead. The episode also drew a smaller reference from a well-known episode of The Twilight Zone, in which a man sneaks into a bank vault to read in peace and ends up trapped inside after a serious accident occurs outside. In a small nod to this, Brian is shown reading the exact same book that character had been reading in that original story, a quiet detail buried inside an episode already packed with references to classic television. Reaction to the episode after it aired was largely positive, with many fans and critics pointing to it as one of the strongest and most memorable entries in the show's long history, specifically because of how far it strayed from the format audiences had come to expect. Rather than relying on the show's usual mix of shock value jokes and unrelated cutaway gags, the episode proved that Brian and Stewie's relationship could carry a full half hour entirely on its own, built around real conversation instead of constant distraction. Some viewers and reviewers noted that this episode gave both characters a rare opportunity to be shown as something closer to fully developed people rather than vehicles for jokes, particularly through Brian's honest admission about his own struggles and Stewie's surprisingly sincere response to hearing it. What makes this particular meltdown different from every other one covered so far in this look at the show's history is that it never actually reaches a visible breaking point the way the others do. There is no outburst, no medical emergency, and no no violent collapse witnessed directly by the audience. Instead, the episode reveals that one of its main characters had already been quietly carrying something this heavy long before the story even begins, hidden completely behind his usual personality until circumstances forced him into a conversation he would likely have avoided under any other situation. Brian's struggle was never something building up in front of the audience across the runtime of the episode. It had already been there the entire time, sitting underneath every earlier joke and every earlier moment of intellectual superiority he had shown across the series, waiting for the right set of circumstances to finally bring it out into the open.
This also marks a turning point in how the show treats the bond between Brian and Stewie going forward. Their relationship had always been built around a strange, uneven mix of genuine affection and constant bickering, with Stewie frequently treating Brian more like a convenient tool for his schemes than a true friend. This episode strips away that dynamic entirely, if only for 1/2 hour, and shows both characters being completely honest with each other about how much they actually mean to one another underneath all of the usual friction. It does not erase the fighting or sarcasm that defines their relationship in every other episode, but it does confirm, in a way the show rarely allows itself to do so directly, that the connection between them runs far deeper than the jokes usually let on. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously.
Some meltdowns in this family stay hidden until the right pressure finally forces them into the open. The next one comes from an entirely different kind of crisis, one where saving somebody else's life means giving up a piece of your own, and where a toddler with no patience for sentiment has to decide just how far loyalty is supposed to go. Section 7. Brian's Kidney Sacrifice. New kidney in town. Family Guy has built plenty of episodes around Peter making a bad decision that spirals into something much bigger than he expected, but few of those decisions ever come as close to actually killing him as the one at the center of New Kidney in Town. This episode, the 8th episode of the show's 9th season, aired on January 9th, 2011, and it takes a fairly ordinary setup, Peter getting hooked on an energy drink, and pushes it into a full medical crisis that forces Brian to consider giving up his own life to save him.
Unlike most of Peter's usual mishaps, which tend to resolve themselves quickly with little lasting consequence, this episode lets the fallout stretch out across weeks of the story, giving the crisis enough time to actually feel serious before the show pulls back at the very last moment. The trouble starts with something small and completely relatable. Peter gets introduced to Red Bull by his friends and quickly becomes hooked on the drink, downing it constantly and riding the intense bursts of energy it gives him. His behavior becomes so extreme and out of control that Lois eventually decides enough is enough, pouring out his remaining supply of the drink in an attempt to stop him from damaging his health any further. Rather than accepting this and moving on, Peter decides the better solution is to simply make his own version of the drink at home, reasoning through a piece of logic that only makes sense inside his own head. He decides that since Red Bull works as a kind of fuel for the body, and kerosene is also a kind of fuel, the two must essentially be interchangeable. Brian warns him directly that adding kerosene to anything he plans on drinking is an incredibly dangerous idea and could seriously damage his body, but Peter ignores the warning completely, convinced that whatever effect it has on him will only make him stronger in the end. Peter drinks his homemade concoction anyway, and the results are immediate and severe. He collapses almost right away, and the family quickly learns that the kerosene he consumed has caused serious and immediate damage to his kidneys, leaving him in a state of kidney failure that requires ongoing medical treatment just to keep him stable. Since a matching donor kidney is not something that can simply be found overnight, Peter is placed on a waiting list and told he will need to undergo regular dialysis treatments to manage his condition until a proper transplant becomes available. For 3 weeks, Peter sticks with this routine of constant dialysis, though the toll it takes on his day-to-day life clearly starts wearing on him. Eventually, encouraged by his friends Joe and Quagmire, Peter decides to skip one of his scheduled treatments so the group can spend the afternoon at the bar watching an old television show together instead. This decision turns out to be a serious mistake. Skipping the treatment causes Peter's condition to deteriorate rapidly, leaving him jaundiced and causing him to begin vomiting blood, a clear sign that his body cannot continue much longer without receiving an actual transplant rather than just ongoing dialysis to manage the symptoms. With Peter's health declining quickly, the family starts searching more urgently for a compatible kidney donor. Lois steps forward first, offering to donate one of her own kidneys without hesitation, only to be told by Dr. Hartman that she is not a match for her husband after all. In a darkly comic twist typical of the show's sense of humor, Hartman reveals instead that Lois happens to be a match for an unrelated young girl in a nearby hospital room who also happens to be in need of a kidney, a detail the show treats as an absurd throwaway joke rather than pursuing any further, quickly shifting attention back to Peter's situation. situation. It is Brian who ultimately turns out to be a match for Peter, a discovery that initially seems like a stroke of good luck for the family. There is a serious complication attached to this discovery, however.
Because dog kidneys are smaller and weaker than human kidneys, doctors explain that a single kidney donation from Brian would not be enough to help Peter recover. The only way the transplant could actually work would require Brian to donate both of his kidneys at once, a procedure that would leave him with no kidneys of his own and would, as a direct and unavoidable result, take his life in order to save Peter's. Despite understanding exactly what this decision would cost him, Brian chooses to go through with the procedure anyway. His reasoning centers on a deep sense of loyalty and gratitude toward Peter, who took him in and treated him as a full member of the family at a point in his life when he otherwise would have had nowhere to go. Brian explains that he sees this sacrifice as a way of returning that kindness, pointing out that as a dog, his own natural lifespan was already going to be far shorter than a human's remaining years, and that giving up whatever time he had left felt like a fair trade if it meant Peter could go on living for decades longer than he otherwise would have. Before the scheduled surgery, Brian takes time to speak individually with different members of the family, treating these conversations almost like a set of final goodbyes, given what he believes is about to happen to him. He offers Meg some blunt but affectionate advice about understanding her own limitations, rather than reaching for goals that may be out of her grasp, while telling Chris something closer to the opposite, encouraging him to aim as high as possible without holding himself back. These small, individually tailored messages add a layer of emotional weight to the episode, showing Brian using what he believes are his final moments to genuinely try to leave something meaningful behind for the children in the household, rather than simply focusing on his own fear about what is coming. Word of Brian's plan eventually reaches Stewie, and the news devastates him in a way that goes far beyond his usual reactions to family drama. Refusing to accept the idea that Brian might actually die, Stewie takes matters into his own hands by kidnapping Brian while he is asleep and bringing him to a local playground, apparently intending for the two of them to simply hide there indefinitely rather than allow the surgery to happen at all. This moment shows a side of Stewie that rarely surfaces so directly in the series, stripping away his usual sarcasm and revealing genuine, overwhelming fear at the thought of losing someone he cares about deeply. His crying during this scene is described as unusually intense and messy, even by the show's exaggerated animation style, visibly overtaking his face as he clings to Brian, unwilling to let him go through with what he sees as a fatal decision. Brian eventually manages to talk Stewie down from this desperate plan, using an argument built around what Stewie actually needs most. He points out to Stewie that, while losing a dog would certainly be painful, losing a father entirely would be a far greater loss for him to carry, framing Peter's survival as something Stewie needs on a deeper level than his attachment to Brian himself. This argument works, and Stewie ultimately agrees to let Brian go through with the plan, setting aside his own fear in order to prioritize what he understands, even through his grief, to be the right decision for the family as a whole. With Stewie's reluctant blessing, Brian and Peter prepare for the operation that everyone believes will cost Brian his life in order to save Peter's. Just as the procedure is about to begin, however, the episode delivers its final major turn. Dr. Hartman arrives, dramatically dressed in a hospital gown, revealing that he too happens to be a compatible match for Peter's transplant, and has personally decided to donate one of his own kidneys instead of allowing Brian to go through with the far more dangerous procedure. Hartman adds an additional piece of information that reframes the entire situation, explaining that there had actually been serious doubts all along about whether a kidney transplant using a dog's organs would have even worked successfully on a human body in the first place, meaning that Brian's sacrifice might have ended his life without actually managing to save Peter's in return. This last-minute reveal spares Brian's life entirely, allowing Peter to receive a working kidney from Hartman instead, while Brian walks away from the situation completely unharmed. The family reacts with visible relief and joy at the news that Brian will not have to die after all, closing out the episode's main storyline on a note of genuine happiness rather than tragedy, even though the story had spent much of its runtime treating Brian's potential death as a very real and serious outcome, rather than something the show was clearly always going to avoid. Running alongside this central storyline is a much lighter subplot involving Chris. With President Barack Obama scheduled to visit his school, Chris is assigned to write an essay about hope for his English class ahead of the visit. Struggling to come up with anything meaningful or original on his own, Chris turns to his sister Meg for help, and after she shares her own genuine thoughts and ideas on the subject, Chris simply copies them and presents her words as his own completed essay. This subplot exists mostly to provide a lighter comedic contrast to the heavier drama unfolding around Peter's medical crisis, giving the episode a brief break from its more emotional mainstream Brian's story before returning to the far more serious situation involving Brian. Reception to the episode after it aired was largely positive, with several reviewers specifically praising how effectively the show balanced real emotional stakes with its usual sense of humor throughout Brian's storyline. Critics highlighted the sincerity behind Brian's willingness to sacrifice himself for Peter as a standout moment for the show, even while acknowledging that the emotional weight of the storyline carried some risk of feeling overly sentimental, given how frequently the series shifts between drama and absurd comedy from one scene to the next. Stewie's reaction to the situation was also frequently singled out as one of the more genuinely touching moments in the episode, with reviewers noting that his fear of losing Brian added real depth to a relationship the show usually treats with far more sarcasm and detachment. Some criticism was directed at the Obama-related subplot involving Chris, with certain reviewers feeling that this smaller storyline felt unnecessary compared to the strength of the main plot involving Peter and Brian. What sets this particular meltdown apart from the others already covered is the direction the emotional weight travels throughout the story. Meg's outburst, Chris's collapse, Patrick's violent episodes, Stewie's fear of death, Brian's addiction, and the quiet confession shared inside the bank vault all center on one character working through something happening directly to themselves. This episode instead builds its entire emotional core around one character choosing to give up his own life specifically to save someone else, turning the crisis into a story about sacrifice rather than personal breakdown. Brian's decision is calm, deliberate, and made with full understanding of what it will cost him, standing in sharp contrast to outbursts driven by anger, panic, or overwhelming fear. The real emotional collapse in this episode does not belong to Brian at all. It belongs to Stewie, who has to confront the possibility of losing someone he loves through no fault of his own, forced to sit with a kind of helplessness that none of the other characters covered so far have had to face in quite the same way. The episode also stands out because it lets a decision this serious play out across weeks of story time, rather than compressing it into a single dramatic moment. Peter's condition worsens gradually. The search for a donor takes real time to unfold, and Brian's choice to sacrifice himself is given room to settle in before the story pulls the rug out from under everyone with Hartman's last-minute reveal. This slower pacing allows the emotional stakes to feel more grounded than they might have if the entire crisis had been resolved within a single episode's rushed timeline. Even though the show ultimately chooses, as it almost always does, to pull back from actually following through on the tragedy it spent so much time building toward. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Some meltdowns in this family get interrupted just before the worst outcome actually happens. The next one does not get that same kind of last-minute rescue, and instead forces the entire family to sit with a loss the show does not take back. Section 8. Brian's Death. Life of Brian. Every meltdown covered so far in this look at Family Guy has centered on a character surviving something difficult and finding some way to keep moving forward afterward. Life of Brian breaks that pattern completely. This episode, the 6th episode of the show's 12th season, aired on November 24th, 2013, and it does something the series had never actually done before with one of its core characters. It kills Brian Griffin, the family dog and one of the show's most central voices, without immediately reversing the decision by the end of the same episode. For a series built around a mostly unchanging cast living through an endless stream of consequence-free chaos, this episode broke that formula in a way that produced one of the loudest reactions in the show's history. The episode opens with Stewie and Brian in the middle of another time travel adventure, something the two of them had done together many times across earlier seasons, using a machine Stewie built for exactly this purpose. This particular trip sends them back to 17th century Jamestown, where the two of them end up caught in a series of increasingly dangerous situations that threaten to alter major events in history. After narrowly avoiding disaster, the pair manages to fix the timeline and return safely to the present, but the experience clearly shakes Stewie in a way that earlier trips had not. Worn down by how close he and Brian had come to permanently damaging history, and by extension putting themselves in serious danger, Stewie makes the decision to destroy his time machine for good, smashing it apart so that it can never be used again. This decision, made with the intention of keeping both of them safe from future disasters, ends up carrying a much heavier weight than Stewie could have possibly understood in the moment. Shortly after destroying the machine, Stewie and Brian head to the local junkyard, where they come across an old street hockey net. Thinking it might be fun to use for some exercise, the two of them decide to bring it home. While setting the net up outside, tragedy strikes without warning. Brian is hit directly by an out-of-control car, struck with enough force to leave him critically injured on the spot. The Griffin family rushes him immediately to the veterinarian, hoping that his injuries can be treated in time. time, but the damage turns out to be far too severe for him to recover from. At the vet's office, surrounded by the family that had shared his entire life with him, Brian is told that his injuries are fatal, and the people closest to him gather to say their final goodbyes before he passes away. In his last moments, Brian manages to express his love for the family one final time before dying, closing out one of the most emotionally direct scenes the series had produced up to that point. The reactions to Brian's death vary sharply from character to character, reflecting each person's very different relationship with him across the years. Lois responds with deep, visible grief, reacting to the loss in a way that treats Brian as a full member of the family rather than simply a pet. Stewie is utterly devastated, collapsing into tears over the sudden loss of the companion he had spent countless adventures with across the show's history, including the very time travel trips that indirectly led to this moment. Peter's initial reaction stands out as noticeably different from the rest of the family, responding with an oddly detached, almost joking tone, rather than immediate sorrow, a moment that some viewers pointed to afterward as an unusual choice given the seriousness of what had just happened, though it is consistent with how Peter's character often processes emotionally heavy situations throughout the series. In the aftermath of Brian's death, Stewie is left picking up the broken pieces of the very hockey net that had indirectly caused the accident, and the guilt of the situation weighs heavily on him. Blaming both himself and the decision to destroy his time machine, Stewie starts to wonder whether rebuilding the machine might give him a chance to go back and prevent Brian's death from happening in the first place. This idea offers a brief flicker of hope, suggesting that the show might use its own established time travel rules to undo the tragedy before the episode even ends. That hope is cut short almost immediately, however, when Stewie discovers that his usual supplier, the person he relies on for the rare materials needed to rebuild the machine, has been arrested after unknowingly drawing a religious figure in a way that violated certain beliefs, leaving Stewie without any way to acquire the parts he needs. With this last possible option closed off, Brian's death is left standing as something the show is not going to reverse within this particular episode. A rare moment where consequences in the Family Guy universe are allowed to actually stick. With no way left to bring Brian back, the family and their close friends gather for his funeral, marking one of the more solemn extended sequences the show has ever produced. Peter delivers a heartfelt eulogy that visibly moves everyone in attendance, a moment played with far more sincerity than most of Peter's usual dialogue throughout the series. Even in the middle of this serious scene, the show does not abandon its comedic instincts entirely. Quagmire, a character who had made no secret of disliking Brian throughout much of the series, is shown paying no attention to the funeral at all, instead watching a baseball game on his phone and getting visibly frustrated at a player's performance during the middle of the service. Joe, another close family friend, also becomes the target of a smaller comedic moment during the funeral, when a grieving stranger confronts him, seemingly under the mistaken impression that he is somehow responsible for solving the mystery of who was driving the car that killed Brian. As Brian's casket is finally lowered into the ground, Stewie throws a single rose onto it, and the family stands together, watching in visible sorrow as the funeral comes to its end. Following the funeral, the show moves forward roughly a month in time, showing the Griffin family still clearly missing Brian's presence in their daily lives. Rather than leaving an empty space in the household, Lois decides that the best path forward is to bring in a new dog, and the family eventually adopts a smooth-talking, Italian-accented dog named Vinny, who quickly starts trying to find his own place within the family dynamic that Brian had occupied for so many years beforehand. This decision sets up the next chapter of the larger story, positioning Vinny as a kind of temporary replacement for Brian, while the show continues working through the emotional fallout of his death across the episodes that follow. The reaction to this episode once it aired went far beyond the usual discussion that follows a typical Family Guy episode. Within hours of the broadcast, a petition appeared online calling on the show's creator, Seth MacFarlane, and Fox to bring Brian back, and this petition ended up gathering more than 100,000 signatures in a remarkably short period of time. This level of public reaction to a fictional character's death on an adult animated comedy was unusual, reflecting just how deeply attached longtime viewers had become to Brian across the show's many seasons. Critics were divided in their responses as well. Some reviewers described Brian's death scene as genuinely moving, noting that it came as close as the series had ever managed to real emotional weight, while others criticized the decision as a cheap or manipulative way to generate attention and controversy, rather than a storytelling choice made purely for creative reasons. When later asked directly about the possibility of backlash from longtime fans, Seth MacFarlane responded by expressing confidence that the show's audience had built up enough trust over the years to know that decisions like this one were made deliberately and with intention, rather than as a careless attempt to shock people with without any larger plan behind it. The episode's title itself carries its own small piece of outside reference, drawing its name directly from the well-known film Life of Brian by the British comedy group Monty Python, a connection that adds a layer of dark humor to an episode centered on the death of a character who happens to share that same first name. This kind of reference fits comfortably within the show's long-standing habit of pulling titles and jokes from other pieces of media throughout its run, even when the subject matter being referenced ends up being far more serious than a simple title pun might suggest on its own. What makes this particular Meltdown different from every other one covered so far is the fact that it does not actually belong to any single character reacting to a personal crisis. Instead, it is a shared moment of loss experienced across the entire family at once, with each person processing that loss in a completely different way based on their own individual relationship with Brian throughout the years. Lois grieves with open sorrow. Stewie collapses under the weight of guilt and heartbreak tied directly to his own actions. Peter responds with an oddly detached tone that reflects his usual difficulty processing serious emotion in a straightforward way. Even Quagmire's blatant disinterest during the funeral says something about how differently each character valued Brian's presence in their lives, offering a strange but honest reminder that not everyone in a family reacts to the same loss in the same way, even within a household as close-knit as the Griffins.
This episode also stands apart because of how the show chooses to handle its own internal rules. Time travel had already been established as an available tool within the series, one that Stewie had used multiple times to fix mistakes or undo dangerous situations in earlier storylines. By deliberately closing off that option through Stewie's inability to acquire replacement parts, the show makes a clear choice to let a serious consequence actually remain in place, at least for the time being, rather than relying on its own established shortcuts to erase the tragedy immediately. This decision is part of what gave the episode its unusual emotional weight compared to most of the show's other storylines, since audiences watching had no immediate reassurance that this loss would simply be undone by the time the credits rolled, the way so many other dramatic moments across the series typically are. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Some meltdowns in this family end with the credits and never get mentioned again. This one refuses to stay buried, because somewhere out there, a version of the exact tool that could undo everything is still sitting untouched, and someone in this family is about to remember it exists. Section 9. Stewie's Rescue. Christmas Guy. Most decisions made inside the Family Guy universe get treated as permanent once the story moves forward, even when the show has access to tools that could easily undo them. Christmas Guy breaks that pattern in one of the most direct ways the series has ever attempted, using a piece of technology the show had already spent years establishing to reverse a death that had shaken its audience just 3 weeks earlier. This episode, the 8th of the show's 12th season, aired on December 15th, 2013, and it exists almost entirely because of how strongly people reacted to the previous storyline involving Brian's death in Life of Brian. Very few episodes in the show's long history can trace their entire existence back to a single audience reaction the way this one can, and that alone makes it worth looking at closely, separate from whether the story itself succeeds on its own terms. The episode opens with a storyline that has nothing to do with Brian at all, at least on the surface. Peter learns that Carter, Lois's wealthy and famously difficult father, has canceled the town's annual Christmas carnival held at the mall he owns. Determined to save the event and bring some holiday spirit back to the town, Peter takes it upon himself to try to convince Carter to reverse his decision. Peter tries several different approaches to reach him, including attempts built around forcing Carter to drink eggnog and getting him to loosen up in other exaggerated, comedic ways, typical of Peter's usual problem-solving style. None of these early attempts manage to change Carter's mind. It is only when Peter suggests, somewhat bluntly, that people might start assuming Carter's dislike of Christmas makes him seem like he is acting in a way associated with a different religious group, that Carter suddenly reverses his position entirely, agreeing to let the carnival move forward after all. This subplot takes up much of the episode's early runtime, giving the impression at first that it might be the main focus of the entire story, and for viewers watching without knowing what was coming later in the episode, it would have been easy to assume this was simply a fairly ordinary, holiday-themed episode, built around a grumpy relative learning to embrace the season. This structure was actually deliberate on the part of the writers, and it reflects how the show chose to handle the return of a character whose death had generated national headlines only weeks earlier. Rather than opening directly with Brian's resurrection, or building the entire episode around Stewie's grief from the first scene, the show spends a significant portion of its runtime on what looks like an unrelated holiday plot, only shifting its attention toward the real purpose of the episode once that smaller story has run its course. This kind of pacing choice meant that audiences tuning in, already aware of the anticipation surrounding Brian's possible return, had to sit through a full storyline about a mall carnival before the show even began addressing the question everyone actually wanted answered. Running quietly underneath this storyline is Stewie's ongoing grief over losing Brian, still very much unresolved since his death in the earlier episode.
Despite the family's attempt to move forward with a new dog named Vinny, who had joined the household roughly a month after Brian's funeral, Stewie continues to struggle with the loss in a way the rest of the family has not fully addressed. His frustration builds throughout the episode, eventually leading him into a destructive streak once the family discovers that the Christmas carnival they had been looking forward to has been cancelled, adding fuel to a sadness that clearly runs much deeper than simple disappointment over a cancelled event. This destructive behavior is shown as a pattern that has apparently been building for some time leading up to the events of this particular episode, suggesting that Stewie's grief had not simply faded away during the month that passed between Brian's funeral and this holiday storyline, even though the rest of the family appears to have settled into a new routine involving Vinny by this point.
Vinny himself is introduced with a very specific personality that sets him apart clearly from Brian, giving the show an easy way to highlight exactly what Stewie is missing without directly comparing the two characters line by line. Where Brian carries himself with a certain kind of intellectual superiority, frequently quoting authors and treating himself as smarter than most of the people around him, Vinny is written as a smooth-talking, streetwise dog with a distinct accent and background rooted in a much more working-class, city-oriented personality. This contrast is part of what makes Vinny's later attempt to imitate Brian's personality land as such an obviously doomed effort, since the entire appeal of Vinny as a character up to this point had been built around him being almost the complete opposite of the dog he replaced. Even once the carnival is restored, thanks to Peter's efforts with Carter, the event fails to lift Stewie's mood in any meaningful way.
While visiting the mall's Santa Claus as part of the carnival festivities, Stewie is asked the standard question about what he wants for Christmas, and in that moment, he finally admits, if only to himself and to Santa, that all he really wants is to have Brian back. This is treated as a completely unrealistic wish, given the circumstances, and even the mall Santa reacts with visible skepticism at the idea, having no way of knowing that the show is about to actually attempt making it happen. This scene works as a quiet but important turning point in the episode, since it is the first moment where Stewie says out loud to another character exactly what has been sitting underneath all of his frustration and destructive behavior throughout the earlier parts of the episode. Everything leading up to this point had shown the symptoms of his grief, without ever letting him name the actual cause directly, and this scene finally puts it into words.
In an effort to help Stewie feel better, Vinny tries taking on a version of Brian's old personality, attempting to act intellectual and worldly in the same way Brian often carried himself throughout the series. Despite putting genuine effort into this attempt, including giving Stewie gifts along the way, Vinny's impression fails to bring Stewie any real comfort, since nothing about the imitation can actually replace what Stewie lost when Brian died. Part of what makes this attempt fall so flat within the story is that Vinny is not simply performing a bad impression for comedic effect. He appears to be sincerely trying to give Stewie something that will actually help him feel less alone in his grief, making the failure land as something closer to a quiet, sad moment, rather than a purely comedic beat, even though the show still frames it with enough humor to keep the scene from becoming overly heavy. One small detail from this stretch of the episode involves a mix-up with a gift, where Vinny accidentally hands Stewie something meant for an entirely different recipient, a mistake that ends up being noticed later by people who were never supposed to receive it in the first place, adding one more layer of the show's usual background comedy running alongside the more emotional main plot. Hoping a change of scenery might help, Vinny takes Stewie back to the mall one more time, and it is during this second visit that the episode's central twist begins to take shape. While at the mall, Stewie spots a version of his own past self, caught in the middle of buying a toy during a moment that lines up directly with a scene shown earlier in Life of Brian, specifically the exact stretch of time just before Brian's fatal accident occurred. This detail connects directly back to a small moment from the earlier episode, where Stewie had briefly appeared using his time machine for an unrelated errand just before the accident that killed Brian took place, a detail that had seemed like nothing more than a throwaway joke at the time, but ends up becoming the key piece of the entire rescue plan months later. Realizing what this means, Stewie puts together a plan built entirely around the show's own established time travel rules, since his past self, appearing in this exact moment from before the accident, still has access
access to a working time machine, Stewie understands that if he can get his hands on that machine, he could use it to travel back and prevent Brian's death from ever happening in the first place, essentially rewriting the sequence of events the audience had already watched play out in the previous episode. To pull this plan off, Stewie enlists Vinny's help directly.
Vinny distracts the earlier version of Stewie by appealing to his vanity, giving present-day Stewie the chance to slip the return device out of his past self's backpack without being noticed. This moment plays out with a certain amount of tension built into it, despite the show's usual comedic tone, since the entire plan depends on a very small window of opportunity involving two versions of the same character crossing paths without one becoming aware of the other's presence in a way that could cause complications. With the device now in his possession, Stewie prepares to travel back to the exact moment right before Brian's accident, fully understanding the personal cost this decision will carry for him. Since successfully saving Brian would completely rewrite the timeline moving forward, Stewie realizes that this change would also erase the very reason Vinny ever came into the family's life in the first place, since Vinny had only joined the household because Brian had died. Before leaving, Stewie takes a moment to say goodbye to Vinny, acknowledging directly that this action will mean the two of them will never actually meet in the version of events he is about to create. A small but meaningful detail that gives Vinny's role in the episode real emotional weight, despite his time in the series being cut short by his own choice to help make this rescue possible. Vinny responds to this goodbye with a notable amount of calm acceptance, treating the coming erasure of his own existence within this timeline as something he is willing to face without complaint, given that his entire purpose in helping Stewie was built around getting Brian back, regardless of what it meant for his own place in the family. Traveling back to the crucial moment, Stewie arrives just in time to physically save Brian from being struck by the oncoming car that had killed him in the earlier episode. Brian, confused but overjoyed to suddenly find himself alive and safe, listens as Stewie explains what has happened, revealing that he has come back from the future specifically to prevent his death. Brian reacts with genuine gratitude, acknowledging how unusual this level of devotion actually is, noting that plenty of other families in his position might have simply accepted the loss and moved on with a new pet, rather than going to such extreme lengths to bring him back. This exchange between the two of them closes the loop on the emotional weight the show had been building since Brian's death, giving both characters a direct moment to acknowledge exactly what almost happened, and exactly what one of them was willing to risk in order to prevent it from staying that way.
With Brian's fate now successfully changed, the future version of Stewie who made this journey fades out of existence, an expected consequence of altering the timeline in a way that erases the very sequence of events that had originally created him in his current form. Back in the present, now permanently altered thanks to Stewie's actions, the Griffin family celebrates the holidays together, with Brian alive and fully part of the household once again, exactly as he had been before the accident ever happened. As a small gesture of thanks for having his life saved, Brian gives Stewie a framed photograph of the two of them together, closing the episode on a warm, sentimental note that stands in sharp contrast to the grief and mourning that had defined the earlier episode covering his death. This closing image gives the audience a clear visual bookend to the entire 3-episode arc that had started with Brian's death, moved through a month of mourning and a temporary replacement dog, and finally ended with father and son, or in this case, dog and toddler, back exactly where they had started before any of it happened. The decision to bring Brian back in this way did not happen without some notable behind-the-scenes drama. According to information later revealed through official commentary on the series, the original plan for this stretch of episodes had actually been very different from what ended up airing. The initial intention had been for Brian to remain dead permanently, with Vinny fully replacing him as the family's dog going forward for the rest of the season and potentially beyond.
This plan changed only after the intensity of the public reaction to Brian's death made it clear that keeping him gone permanently was going to cause lasting damage to how audiences felt about the show. The scale of the backlash reportedly went beyond simple online complaints, with the writer credited for Life of Brian later revealing that he personally received threatening messages from upset fans following the character's death. Given the severity of this reaction, the show's network reportedly pushed the creative team to reverse course and bring Brian back, rather than sticking with the original plan, leading directly to the storyline seen in this episode. This kind of direct, traceable link between a specific audience reaction and a specific creative decision made just a few weeks later is fairly unusual for a long-running series, and it says something about just how deeply invested longtime viewers had become in Brian's continued presence on the show after so many years. Fan and critical reaction to Christmas Sky after it aired reflected a clear divide in opinion. Some viewers welcomed the decision to bring Brian
Brian back, framing it as the show giving distressed fans exactly what they had been asking for ever since his death was first announced weeks earlier. Others viewed the resolution far more critically, seeing it as a convenient shortcut that undercut whatever emotional weight Life of Brian had managed to build in the first place, essentially using the show's own time travel mechanics to avoid dealing with any lasting consequences from a decision the creative team had made only a few episodes earlier.
This second group of critics often pointed out that the entire situation demonstrated a kind of contradiction at the heart of the show's approach to the storyline, since the writers had apparently been willing to generate significant emotional impact and widespread news coverage by killing off a major character, only to reverse that same decision within a matter of weeks once the backlash became too difficult to ignore, raising questions among some viewers about how much thought had actually gone into the original decision to kill Brian off in the first place. There was also broader recognition that Vinny, despite being introduced only as a temporary replacement following Brian's death, had become a genuinely well-liked character in his own right by the time this episode aired, largely due to the sincerity and selflessness he showed in helping make Brian's rescue possible, even knowing it would mean erasing his own place within the family entirely.
Many viewers who had initially resisted accepting Vinny as any kind of real replacement for Brian found themselves warming up to him specifically because of how he behaved in this final episode featuring him, treating his willingness to help undo his own existence as a genuinely selfless act rather than something forced or hollow. This shift in audience opinion toward Vinny by the end of his brief run on the show stands as one of the more unusual outcomes connected to this entire storyline, since a character originally created to replace someone the fans wanted back ended up earning a surprising amount of goodwill purely through the manner of his own departure.
Some corners of the show's audience also debated the broader implications of using time travel to solve a problem this significant, since the show had already established time travel as an available tool for Stewie across multiple earlier storylines, including the very episode where Brian originally died, which itself involved Stewie returning from an earlier time travel mission gone wrong. This meant that longtime viewers were already fully aware that time travel existed as a mechanism within the show's world, making the eventual decision to use it to reverse Brian's death feel, to some viewers, like an inevitable outcome rather than a surprising twist. Others felt that using an already established tool in this way represented a reasonable and consistent use of the show's own internal logic, rather than an outside solution introduced purely for convenience.
What sets this particular meltdown apart from the 8 already covered in this look at the show's history is that it is the only one built entirely around undoing a previous entry, rather than standing as its own separate, self-contained event. Every other storyline discussed so far, whether it involves anger finally boiling over, a body giving out under pressure, a childhood trauma resurfacing, a fear of death taking hold, an addiction spiraling out of control, a quiet confession shared in isolation, or a sacrifice nearly made out of loyalty, exists as its own complete arc, with its own beginning and ending. This episode exists specifically because the ending of an earlier storyline proved too difficult for audiences to accept, turning the show's own internal rules about time travel into a tool for directly responding to how viewers reacted in the real world, rather than simply continuing forward with whatever consequences the earlier episode had already put into motion.
In this sense, the episode occupies a strange position within the larger history of the series, functioning less as a standalone piece of storytelling and more as a direct, almost real-time response to a very specific and very public moment of audience backlash. The episode also raises a quieter question buried underneath its more obvious plot about grief and Christmas wishes, centered on what it actually costs to undo a loss like this one. Saving Brian does not come free within the logic of the story. It requires erasing Vinny's entire place within the family, along with every moment the show had spent building him into a character audiences had grown to appreciate over the preceding weeks. Stewie makes this trade willingly, prioritizing Brian's life over the version of the family that had formed around Vinny in his absence. But the show does not entirely brush past the weight of that decision, giving Vinny a genuine moment of farewell before he disappears from the timeline for good. This detail adds a small but real layer of complexity to what could have otherwise played out as a completely clean, uncomplicated happy ending, since restoring one relationship within the family directly requires sacrificing another one that had, at least for a short time, become just as real within the world of the show. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Some meltdowns in this family get erased completely once the right fix finally arrives. The next one does not involve grief, loss, or anything close to death at all. It comes from something much closer to home, a sudden and deeply personal revelation about a a parent that forces one character to unravel everything he thought he understood about where he came from. Section 10. Quagmire's Emotional Collapse. Quagmire's dad. Every meltdown covered so far in this look at Family Guy's history has stayed within the Griffin household in one way or another, whether the story centered on Peter, Lois, Chris, Meg, Brian, or Stewie. This final entry shifts the focus onto Glenn Quagmire, the family's next-door neighbor and longtime friend, whose entire understanding of his own father unravels over the course of a single episode. Quagmire's Dad, the 18th episode of the show's 8th season, aired on Fox on May 9th, 2010, and it remains one of the most heavily discussed and debated episodes in the entire series, not because of how funny or dramatic it was, but because of how it chose to handle its central subject matter. The episode begins with Quagmire's father, Dan Quagmire, arriving in Quahog for a visit tied to an event honoring his military service. Dan is introduced to the audience as a decorated war veteran, someone Quagmire has always looked up to and spoken about proudly to his friends. When Peter and Joe meet Dan for the first time, they quickly form assumptions about him based on his mannerisms and storytelling style, jumping to conclusions about his personal life that turn out to be far from accurate. These early assumptions create tension between Peter and Quagmire, since Quagmire strongly defends his father against what he sees as unfair judgment coming from his friends. The turning point of the episode arrives when Quagmire, invited by his father to a formal event held in Dan's honor, finds himself confronted by a group of fellow servicemen who make repeated comments hinting at something about his father that Quagmire does not yet understand. Confused and increasingly frustrated by these comments, Quagmire eventually confronts his father directly, and it is here that Dan reveals the truth. He explains that he has always felt like a woman living inside a man's body, and that he has decided to move forward with gender-affirming surgery in order to live as his true self. This revelation catches Quagmire completely off guard, and rather than reacting with immediate understanding, he struggles visibly with the news, unable to reconcile this new information with the version of his father he had built his entire identity around admiring. Following this revelation, Dan goes through with the surgery, and the show introduces the character afterward under the name Ida, now living as a woman. The transition itself is portrayed as medically successful within the story, and several of Quagmire's friends express support for Dan's decision once they learn the full situation. Quagmire himself, however, continues to struggle emotionally with the change, unable to immediately accept this new version of the parent he grew up idolizing. This inability to adjust becomes the central emotional conflict driving the rest of the episode, with Quagmire's discomfort escalating rather than easing as more people around him express understanding that he himself cannot yet find. Tension between Quagmire and Ida builds further during a dinner scene where Peter, in his usual blunt and socially unaware manner, asks Ida a series of intrusive questions about the surgery in front of the entire group. Rather than reacting with offense, Ida responds openly and without any visible discomfort, willingly discussing details of her own experience despite Lois's clear embarrassment at Peter's behavior. This openness, rather than helping the situation, ends up frustrating Quagmire even further, and he storms away from the dinner and returns home, unable to process the entire situation any longer. Later that night, Ida follows Quagmire back to his house in an attempt to repair their relationship. The two of them have an honest conversation about where things stand between them, and by the end of this exchange, Quagmire appears to reach a point of acceptance regarding his father's identity, seemingly resolving the central conflict that had defined the episode up to that point. This moment is treated within the story as the emotional turning point where father and son manage to find their way back to some version of the relationship they had before, despite everything that changed along the way. The episode does not end there, however. Shortly after this reconciliation, Ida reveals that she has begun seeing someone new, and when Quagmire asks who this new partner is, he learns that it is Brian, the Griffin family's dog, who had unknowingly slept with Ida earlier in the episode without realizing her connection to Quagmire. This revelation sends Quagmire into a rage, and he rushes over to the Griffin household, finds Brian hiding in fear, and beats him severely as punishment for the situation, regardless of the fact that Brian himself had no idea who Ida actually was at the time. As Quagmire storms out afterward, Brian gets in one final, deliberately cruel remark aimed at hurting him on his way out, closing the episode on a tone that mixes its earlier emotional reconciliation with one more burst of anger and comedic violence. When this episode aired, it generated one of the most significant reactions the show had produced up to that point, though not primarily centered on its comedy or story structure. Multiple advocacy organizations focused on representation for LGBTQ people, most notably GLAAD, spoke out publicly against the episode episode, describing the general feeling within the community as one of serious offense at how the storyline handled its transgender character. The Parents Television Council also criticized the episode, though for different reasons tied to its general concerns about content standards on network television. Critics reviewing the episode were similarly split in their assessments. Some reviewers acknowledged that the episode deserved some credit for attempting to give a sympathetic portrayal of a transgender character on a major network show, while also pointing out specific moments they found deeply insensitive, particularly an extended scene showing Brian's intensely negative physical reaction upon learning the truth about who he had slept with, along with several remarks made by Lois and Peter throughout the episode that many viewers interpreted as reflecting prejudiced attitudes, without the show ever directly addressing or challenging those attitudes within the story itself. Seth MacFarlane, the show's creator, spoke about the episode both before and after it aired.
In the lead-up to its broadcast, he expressed confidence that the transgender community specifically would respond positively to the episode, describing it at the time as one of the most sympathetic portrayals of a transgender character to ever appear on television. Following the backlash that actually emerged after it aired, MacFarlane later reflected on the reaction with some surprise, noting that he had genuinely believed the character of Ida represented a sympathetic depiction, even as many viewers and advocacy groups reached a very different conclusion. Years later, when asked directly about the episode in a later interview, MacFarlane stated that he would not make any large-scale changes to it overall, though he acknowledged that certain individual moments and specific jokes within the episode were the kind of details he might reconsider, rather than the broader concept of the story itself. The episode drew comparisons at the time to an earlier film dealing with related themes, with many critics and audiences noting similarities in tone and approach between this storyline and a 2007 comedy film that had also generated discussion around its handling of related subject matter. Ratings for the episode were solid, by the standards of the show at that point, drawing an estimated 7.22 million households during its original broadcast, according to Nielsen figures, indicating that the controversy surrounding its content did not significantly affect how many people tuned in to watch it when it first aired. Beyond the immediate reaction at the time of broadcast, the episode has continued to generate discussion in later years, as attitudes and understanding around transgender representation in media have continued to shift. Some later critical retrospectives have been more directly critical of the episode than many contemporary reviews were back in 2010, pointing specifically to the extended reaction scene involving Brian as an example of a pattern sometimes referred to in broader discussions of media representation, where a character's negative physical or emotional reaction to learning about a partner's transgender identity is played for extended comedic effect, rather than treated with more careful consideration. Some of these later critiques have also noted that the episode arrived several years after other television comedies had already introduced transgender characters with what some critics considered more thoughtful handling, making the specific choices made in this particular episode stand out as notably behind the times, even by the standards of television comedy at that specific moment.
What makes this particular meltdown distinct from every other one covered across this entire look at the show's history is where the central emotional collapse actually originates and how the show chooses to resolve it. Quagmire's struggle throughout the episode comes entirely from being confronted with information about someone he loves that forces him to reevaluate an identity he had built much of his own self-image around, specifically his pride in his father as a traditional, decorated war hero.
Unlike Meg's outburst, which forces the family to confront how they had treated her, or Stewie's fear of death, which forces him to sit with an idea he cannot avoid, Quagmire's emotional journey throughout this episode is framed primarily around his own difficulty accepting a truth about someone else, with the story ultimately resolving that difficulty through a reconciliation scene, rather than any lasting confrontation of the biases or reactions that fueled his initial struggle in the first place. This structure is a key reason the episode drew such a divided response, since audiences and critics disagreed sharply on whether the story ultimately supported understanding and acceptance, or whether it simply used a serious real-world topic as a setup for shock value jokes, without meaningfully following through on the more thoughtful angle it initially seemed to be reaching for. Looking back across all 10 of these moments together, from Meg finally speaking years of buried anger out loud, to Chris collapsing under the sudden weight of adult responsibility, to Patrick's violence rooted in a trauma buried since childhood, to Stewie confronting the plain fact of his own mortality, to Brian's quiet slide into addiction and his later confession inside a locked vault, to a sacrifice nearly made out of loyalty, to a death the show chose not to immediately undo, to a rescue built entirely around erasing that same death, and finally, to a father and son forced to rebuild their relationship around a truth neither of them saw coming. One pattern becomes becomes clear.
Family Guy has spent over 2 decades treating its characters as sources of non-stop chaos and jokes. Yet, scattered throughout that same run sit these small, unexpected pockets where the show slows down, drops the usual noise surrounding it, and lets something real sit on screen for just long enough to actually matter, before inevitably moving on to whatever absurd cutaway comes next.
If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.